There exists a question that haunts the corridors of financial independence, whispered in the quiet moments when men calculate the compound interest of their lives. It is not a question of morality nor one of emotional fulfillment, but rather a cold, mathematical inquiry into the nature of power itself. What is the true cost of partnership in an age where wealth has become the primary instrument of freedom? Throughout history, the architects of empire have understood a fundamental truth that remains obscured in our modern discourse. The consolidation of resources requires a singular vision, an uncompromising focus that treats every hour and every dollar as a soldier in a grand campaign. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in 16th century Florence, did not merely compose a manual for political power. He articulated a philosophy of resource allocation that applies as ruthlessly to personal finance as it does to statecraft. When he spoke of virtù, that quality of decisive prowess that separates princes from pretenders, he described something more profound than courage. He described the capacity to marshal all available forces toward a singular objective without hesitation, without division, without the dilution that comes from serving multiple masters. Consider the conventional wisdom that saturates our culture. We are told that partnership is stability, that two incomes are better than one, that the division of labor in a household creates efficiency. These are not lies exactly, but they are truths that serve a particular social order, one that values predictability over explosive growth, comfort over conquest. The uncomfortable reality that few dare to articulate is this: the construction of significant wealth requires a form of aggression that is fundamentally incompatible with the compromises inherent in traditional partnership. It demands periods of strategic deprivation, calculated risks that would terrify anyone with dependence, and an allocation of time and capital so extreme that it appears, to the comfortable masses, as madness. This is not a sermon on the virtues of loneliness. This is a strategic briefing for those who have glimpsed a different possibility. You are not here because you lack options for companionship. You are here because you have recognized that the path to absolute freedom, to the kind of wealth that liberates rather than merely sustains, may require walking alone during the years when the foundation is being laid. History does not remember the balanced lives of careful men. It remembers the obsessed, the singular, those who compress decades of ordinary effort into years of extraordinary focus. What follows is not advice for everyone. It is a framework for those who have decided that their empire, their fortress of sovereignty, must be built before anything else. It is for those who understand that in the economy of power, every attachment is a leverage point, every commitment a constraint, and every division of resources a dilution of force. This is the wealth-building calculus through the eyes of Machiavelli, translated from the politics of Renaissance Italy to the brutal economics of modern empire building. The promise is simple and dangerous. Transform yourself from a provider for others into an absolute sovereign over your own destiny, but understand the price. The work will be lonelier than you imagine. The discipline will be more severe than you anticipate. And the result, if you possess the virtù to see it through, will place you in a category so rare that your former peers will not recognize the chasm that has opened between your life and theirs. The social architecture of modern life rests on several pillars that, when examined closely, reveal themselves to be less structural support and more beautiful mythology. Chief among these is the concept that has been marketed to generations as the foundation of adult stability, the dual-income household. This is not an attack on partnership itself, but rather a surgical examination of how financial partnership alters the mathematics of wealth accumulation in ways that are rarely discussed with intellectual honesty. The conventional narrative presents marriage or long-term cohabitation as a form of economic optimization. two people sharing housing costs, splitting utilities, dividing domestic labor, pooling resources toward common goals. On the surface, the arithmetic appears sound. But this analysis makes a catastrophic error. It assumes that the objective is efficiency in consumption rather than maximization of surplus capital. It optimizes for a comfortable present rather than an exponentially powerful future. Machiavelli understood that the greatest threats to power come not from enemies, but from the obligations that prevent decisive action. In Chapter 15 of The Prince, he writes of the necessity of learning not to be good when goodness impedes the security of one's position. Applied to personal finance, this translates into a brutal question. Does your partnership enable the kind of aggressive capital deployment that builds transformative wealth? Or does it create a floor of required spending that prevents you from operating with the ruthlessness necessary for exponential returns? Consider the psychology at play. When you commit to partnership, you simultaneously commit to a certain baseline of lifestyle. There is pressure, sometimes explicit, but more often implicit, to maintain a home of a certain quality, to take vacations that create memories together, to spend on experiences that bond the relationship, to avoid risks that might jeopardize the shared comfort. These are not evil impulses. They are human, warm, and entirely rational within the frame of building a life together. But they are also the enemy of the kind of single-minded resource allocation that characterizes every story of rapid wealth creation you have ever encountered. The historical pattern is undeniable. Survey the biographies of those who built significant wealth before the age of 40, and you will find a striking commonality. The crucial years of accumulation were characterized by an almost pathological focus. Warren Buffett, living in a modest home, eating the same breakfast every day, spending 12 hours reading annual reports. The young hedge fund managers sleeping on air mattresses in their offices. The entrepreneurs who disappeared from social life entirely for 2 to 3 years while they built their first successful ventures. These were not merely hardworking people. They were individuals who had eliminated every variable that did not serve the immediate objective of capital multiplication. Now introduce a partner into this equation. Suddenly, the freedom to live on rice and eggs while investing 90% of income becomes a source of conflict. The ability to work 16-hour days without apology is now a relationship problem. The decision to quit a stable job to take a calculated risk must pass through a committee of 2, and one member of that committee has legitimate concerns about stability that will, statistically, exert a conservative influence on the decision. This is not about blame. This is about the mathematics of consensus versus dictatorship in resource allocation. The Stoic philosophers, particularly Seneca, developed a concept they called facultas, which translates roughly as power or capability. Money, in the Stoic framework, was not about acquiring possessions, but about expanding your sphere of agency. It was the difference between being subject to the whims of circumstances and being able to dictate terms to the world. This distinction has been lost in modern discourse, where wealth is associated primarily with consumption, comfort, and status display. But for those who study power seriously, money is something else entirely. It is sovereignty in liquid form. Consider the difference between how money functions in partnership versus in solitude. In a traditional relationship, money becomes primarily a defensive instrument. It protects against uncertainty. It provides for shared needs. It creates a buffer against the chaos of the world. This is the money as shield paradigm, and it is perfectly rational for those whose primary objective is the maintenance of a stable, comfortable existence. But there is another paradigm, one that treats money not as defense but as offense. Money as a weapon for acquiring assets, for funding entrepreneurial ventures, for creating income streams that compound upon themselves until they generate their own gravitational pull. The shield paradigm requires consensus, caution. and constant rebalancing towards safety. The sword paradigm requires aggression, acceptance of volatility, and the willingness to allocate resources in ways that appear reckless to anyone not sharing your vision. These two paradigms are not merely different strategies. They are fundamentally incompatible philosophies that cannot coexist in a single financial unit without one dominating the other. And in most partnerships, the shield paradigm wins, because the downside of the sword paradigm is viscerally terrifying to anyone with dependence or commitments. Machiavelli addresses this dynamic when he discusses the concept of necessity. He argues that humans are most dangerous, most innovative, and most effective when they are cornered by necessity. But partnership, by its very design, is an attempt to eliminate necessity, to create abundance where scarcity once existed. Two incomes mean that if one fails, the household does not collapse. This is sold as security, and in terms of preventing disaster, it is. But in terms of forcing the kind of desperate innovation that creates breakthrough success, it is a sedative. It allows both partners to remain in comfortable but mediocre positions because the collective risk of seeking something greater is too high. There is a psychological phenomenon that occurs in long-term relationships that almost no one discusses with candor because it sounds cruel when spoken aloud. It is the slow, almost imperceptible lowering of ambition to match the lesser risk tolerance of the partnership. If one partner is entrepreneurial and the other is risk-averse, the equilibrium does not land at moderate risk-taking. It lands close to risk aversion, because the psychological pain of disappointing or frightening your partner outweighs the potential gain from aggressive action. Over years, this results in a form of self-domestication, where the sharp edges of ambition are filed down in the name of harmony. The Stoics would call this a form of voluntary slavery, and they would not be entirely wrong. When your actions must constantly be justified to another person, when your capital allocation must pass through negotiation rather than immediate execution, you have traded a portion of your sovereignty for the benefits of partnership. For many, this is a trade worth making. But it is a trade nonetheless, and the cost must be acknowledged. You are wealthier in social capital and emotional support. You are poorer in autonomous power and the freedom to operate at the extremes where extraordinary returns reside. Seneca wrote extensively about the slavery of luxury, how men become chained to their possessions and lifestyles until they work not for freedom, but to maintain a standard of living that no longer serves them. This dynamic is amplified exponentially in partnership, where the lifestyle creep occurs twice as fast because two people are justifying expenditures to each other, creating a ratchet effect where the standard of living can easily rise, but only with great conflict can it fall. The man who could live on $1,000 a month alone finds himself spending $4,000 as part of a couple, not because either person is wasteful, but because the shared life they are building requires more infrastructure, more maintenance, more of everything. And thus, the surplus capital that could have been deployed toward liberation is instead allocated toward sustaining a more complex existence. There exists, in economic theory, a concept that rarely makes it into mainstream financial advice because it is uncomfortable to calculate. It is called opportunity cost, and it refers not to the money you spend, but to the value of the path not taken. When you commit to a long-term partnership, particularly one that follows the traditional arc of shared housing, children, and intertwined finances, you incur what might be called a commitment tax. This is not the money you spend on your partner. This is the invisible ledger of opportunities you do not pursue because they are incompatible with your obligations. The most devastating form of the commitment tax is the business not started. Consider the reality of entrepreneurship in the modern age. The majority of successful ventures fail multiple times before finding product-market fit. The timeline from concept to profitability is usually measured in years, not months. During this period, the founder must often work for equity rather than salary, must operate with extreme uncertainty, and must pivot rapidly based on market feedback. Now, attempt this with a partner who reasonably expects a certain level of income stability, who has planned their life around your shared resources, and who views your entrepreneurial venture through the lens of what it means for their security. The psychological weight alone is often enough to prevent the attempt entirely. Machiavelli would recognize this dynamic immediately. In Chapter 25 of The Prince, he discusses the concept of fortuna, fortune or chance, and how men of virtue must be prepared to act decisively when opportunity presents itself. But he also notes that those who are too cautious, too bound by obligations and past patterns, find themselves unable to seize fortune even when it favors them. The commitment tax is precisely this binding force. It is the accumulation of small and large obligations that collectively restrict your range of action until you can only move within a narrow band of acceptable risk. The calculation becomes even more severe when children enter the equation. The moment you become financially responsible for dependents, your ability to take career risks drops precipitously. You cannot easily quit your job to pursue a startup. You cannot relocate for a better opportunity if it disrupts schooling and community. You cannot invest aggressively in volatile assets because the downside could affect their well-being. These are not moral failings. They are rational responses to increased responsibility. But they are also chains, golden or otherwise, that restrict your operational freedom. There is also the more subtle opportunity cost of attention and energy. Building significant wealth almost always requires a period of obsessive focus. This might mean spending evenings and weekends learning a new skill, building a side business, or networking intensely within an industry. Partnership, particularly healthy partnership, requires its own investment of time and emotional energy. There are conversations to be had, conflicts to be resolved, quality time to be maintained, and a general expectation of presence that is incompatible with the kind of disappearing act that characterizes deep work. The entrepreneur who vanishes into his garage for 18 hours a day is a romantic figure in retrospect, but in real time, he is often a source of legitimate frustration to anyone who depends on him for emotional support or shared responsibilities. Machiavelli writes in Chapter 3 about the importance of acting quickly when problems are small, rather than waiting until they become crises. Applied to personal finance, this suggests that the opportunity cost compounds over time. The business you do not start at 25 because you are building a relationship becomes exponentially harder to start at 35 when you have a mortgage and children. The skill you do not develop because you are maintaining work-life balance becomes a gap that widens as others specialize. The network you do not cultivate because you are prioritizing family dinners becomes a disadvantage when you finally try to make a strategic career move. What makes the commitment tax particularly insidious is that it never appears on any balance sheet. There is no line item for opportunities foregone or potential businesses not attempted. The money you spend on your shared life is visible and can be rationalized as investment in the relationship. But the alternate timeline where you deployed those same resources and that same time toward aggressive wealth building remains forever hypothetical. You cannot prove what would have happened, and so the loss remains abstract, easily dismissed as speculation rather than recognized as the most significant financial decision you may ever make. Consider the phenomenon known as lifestyle creep, where expenses rise to match income. This is universal, but in partnership it operates with particular force because of a biological and social imperative that is rarely acknowledged. There is an instinct, particularly strong when building a life with another person, toward nesting, toward creating a home that feels permanent, comfortable, and worthy of the shared future you are constructing. This is not frivolous. This is deeply human. But it is also expensive in ways that extend far beyond the immediate purchases. The comfortable apartment becomes a house. The house requires furniture, maintenance, landscaping, repairs, and property taxes. The kitchen must be equipped not just functionally, but to a standard that allows for entertaining and shared meals. The cars must be reliable, newer models, because the inconvenience of breakdowns now affects two people's schedules. Vacations become expected annual events because experiences together are how you maintain the bond. Each of these expenses is individually justifiable. Collectively, they represent a permanent increase in the amount of income that is consumed rather than invested. Machiavelli understood the concept of expenditure as a strategic choice. In Chapter 16, he discusses whether a prince is better served by generosity or parsimony. His conclusion is ruthlessly practical. It is better to be thought miserly while building your power base, because the prince who spends to maintain a reputation for generosity will eventually exhaust his resources and be forced to tax his people heavily, breeding resentment. Applied personally, this means that the appearance of success, the comfortable lifestyle that signals you have made it, is often the thing that prevents you from actually making it. The capital that goes toward maintaining appearances is capital that does not compound. The man who lives alone can make a different calculation. He can choose strategic poverty, not poverty of circumstance, but poverty as a weapon. He can live in the cheapest acceptable housing, eat the simplest nutritious foods, eliminate all expenditure that does not directly serve the goal of capital accumulation. He can do this not because he is suffering, but because he has recognized that every dollar not spent is a soldier that can be deployed to conquer territory in the financial landscape. And he can maintain this discipline for years, decades even, because he answers to no one but himself and his vision. This is the difference between defensive living and offensive living. In partnership, you are defending a baseline quality of life. You are maintaining what you have built together. In solitude, you are attacking the market, attempting to extract value and convert it into assets that will eventually free you from the need to trade time for money. These are not compatible strategies. They require different mindsets, different daily decisions, and different tolerances for discomfort. The psychological aspect cannot be understated. There is an enormous difference between choosing austerity and having austerity imposed upon you. The single man who lives on 20% of his income and invests the rest is not deprived. He is engaged in a campaign. He knows that the deprivation is temporary and strategic, but attempt the same level of austerity in partnership, and it becomes a source of constant negotiation. Is this sacrifice really necessary? Could we not afford this small luxury? What is the point of earning money if we never enjoy it? These are reasonable questions that have no good answer when one partner is thinking in terms of decades and exponential returns, while the other is thinking in terms of present quality of life. Machiavelli would call this a failure of shared vision, and he would counsel the prince to never enter into partnerships where the fundamental objectives are not perfectly aligned. Because once you are committed, once you have intertwined your finances and your lives, the cost of exit becomes so high that you remain in the partnership even when it is clearly suboptimal from the perspective of your original goals. You have created a structure that exerts its own gravity, pulling you away from extreme action and toward comfortable mediocrity. There is a principle in military strategy that appears across cultures and throughout history. It is the understanding that a general with nothing to lose, fighting with his back against a cliff or river, fights with a desperation and creativity that is almost impossible to defeat. Sun Tzu spoke of death ground, the terrain where soldiers must fight or die, and how wise generals would sometimes artificially create these conditions to unleash maximum effort from their troops. Machiavelli understood this as necessita, the way necessity sharpens the mind and eliminates hesitation. In the realm of personal wealth building, This principle manifests as risk asymmetry. Risk asymmetry refers to the fundamental difference in what you can afford to lose and therefore what you can afford to attempt. The single man, with no dependents, minimal fixed expenses, and total control over his resources, possesses a form of strategic freedom that is almost impossible to replicate in partnership. He can go to zero, he can fail completely, lose everything, and the only person who suffers the consequence is himself. This is not a bug in his strategy. This is the core feature that enables everything else. Consider the calculus of entrepreneurial risk. The vast majority of new businesses fail within the first 5 years. The path to success usually involves multiple failures, course corrections, and periods of zero or negative income. The entrepreneur who is betting only his own time and his own savings operates in an entirely different psychological space than the entrepreneur who knows that his failure will directly impact his partner's quality of life, his children's stability, and his family's financial security. One can take risks that approach recklessness, the other must be prudent. And in the world of exponential returns, prudence is often the enemy of breakthrough success. Machiavelli addresses this dynamic when discussing the difference between mercenaries and citizen soldiers. The mercenary fights for money and will flee when the battle turns unfavorable, because he calculates that his life is worth more than his contract. The citizen defending his home fights with the knowledge that retreat means the destruction of everything he values, and therefore fights with the intensity the mercenary cannot match. But notice the paradox. The single man building wealth is like the mercenary in that he has no home to defend, but he fights with the intensity of the citizen because his entire future is at stake. He has created a form of artificial death ground where failure is personal annihilation, but success is absolute sovereignty. This connects to the concept of anti-fragility, developed by Nassim Taleb. Anti-fragile systems do not merely resist shocks, they grow stronger from volatility and stress. The single man with low fixed costs and high savings is anti-fragile. A recession that destroys others becomes his buying opportunity. A job loss that would devastate a family is for him an opportunity to finally pursue the entrepreneurial venture he has been preparing for. Market chaos that sends others into panic mode becomes the volatility he exploits for asymmetric returns. He has structured his life to benefit from disorder rather than be destroyed by it. Partnership, by contrast, tends toward fragility. There is a baseline of expenses that must be met regardless of external conditions. There are mouths to feed, a home to maintain, and expectations to manage. The two-income household that appeared so stable suddenly becomes vulnerable if both partners work in the same industry that experiences contraction. The diversification that was supposed to provide security instead created a lifestyle that requires both incomes to maintain, and thus the loss of one income becomes a crisis rather than an inconvenience. The strategic advantage of the single builder is that he can weather storms that would sink others, and he can take advantage of opportunities that others must pass on because they cannot afford the downside. When asset prices collapse, he is buying. When the job market contracts, he is using the time to build skills or start ventures. When others are locked into their current positions by obligations, he is negotiating aggressively or walking away from situations that no longer serve him. This mobility, this capacity to operate in chaos, is worth more than any second income could provide. There is also the psychological dimension of knowing you are the only variable in your equation. When success or failure depends entirely on your own decisions and efforts, there is a clarity that is impossible to achieve when your outcomes are partially determined by another person's choices, psychology, and capacity. You cannot blame your partner for being risk-averse. You cannot resent the obligations that your family creates. But you also cannot ignore the way these factors constrain your range of action. The single builder eliminates this entire category of concern. He knows that if he fails, it is because of his decisions. If he succeeds, it is because of his effort. This clarity, this total ownership of outcomes, is itself a form of power that cannot be replicated in shared endeavors. Machiavelli writes that fortune favors the bold, but only when boldness is paired with virtù, the capacity to execute. The single builder has created the conditions where boldness is possible because the downside is contained entirely within himself. He has removed the moral hazard of gambling with other people's well-being. He has eliminated the need to explain or justify risk-taking to anyone who might not share his vision or his risk tolerance. And in doing so, he has given himself permission to operate at the extremes where the greatest opportunities reside, the deals so volatile that only those with nothing to lose can afford to attempt them. Ask yourself honestly, if you had the opportunity to invest in a venture that had a 20% chance of returning 10 times your investment and an 80% chance of losing everything, would you take that bet? If you are single, with low expenses and high savings, the calculation is straightforward. You take the bet multiple times with different opportunities, knowing that you only need to be right once to transform your financial trajectory. If you have a partner and children depending on that capital, the bet becomes irresponsible even though the expected value is positive. And this is the fundamental asymmetry. The single builder has access to a class of opportunities that is simply off-limits to those with obligations. And it is often in this class of high-risk, high-reward scenarios that fortunes are made rather than merely accumulated. There is a currency more valuable than money, more scarce than Bitcoin, more powerful than any asset you can acquire. It is time. Specifically, it is focused, uninterrupted time during which you can operate at the highest level of cognitive function toward a single objective. Wealth, when examined closely, is often not the result of earning more per hour, but of having vastly more hours to deploy toward wealth-generating activities. And this is where the mathematics of partnership versus solitude becomes most stark. Consider the temporal overhead of maintaining a relationship. There are the obvious demands: dates, conversations, quality time together, attending social functions with your partner's network, negotiating decisions about shared resources and future plans. But there are also the invisible demands that accumulate like compound interest in reverse. The emotional bandwidth required to track another person's state of mind, to notice when they need support, to manage conflicts before they escalate. The domestic responsibilities that must be divided and coordinated. The social obligations to both families. The mental space occupied by maintaining the relationship itself as a project separate from any specific activity. Time use studies consistently show that people in relationships spend significantly more time on social and domestic activities compared to their single counterparts, even when controlling for factors like children. This is not wasted time in the sense that it serves important relational functions. But it is time that is not being spent on deep work, on skill development, on building side businesses, on networking within your industry, on consuming information that creates strategic advantages. And time, unlike money, cannot be recovered. Every hour spent managing a relationship is an hour not spent compounding your professional capabilities. The concept of deep work, popularized by Cal Newport but understood intuitively by every person who has built something significant, refers to the ability to focus without distraction on cognitively demanding tasks for extended periods. This is how complex problems get solved, how businesses get built, how skills get mastered. It requires long, uninterrupted blocks where you can load the entire problem space into your mind and manipulate it. Partnership is fundamentally at odds with deep work because partnership requires availability, responsiveness, and the willingness to be interrupted for matters that are important to the relationship, even if they are not directly related to your wealth-building objectives. Machiavelli did not write about time management in the modern sense, but he wrote extensively about the necessity of acting when the moment is right, of being prepared to seize opportunities that require immediate, undivided attention. In The Prince, he discusses how successful leaders must be able to shift their entire focus to the crisis at hand, and how those who are distracted by other concerns find themselves outmaneuvered by more focused opponents. In business and investing, these moments occur regularly. A market dislocation that requires immediate action, a potential partnership that demands a quick decision, an opportunity to acquire an undervalued asset before others recognize its value. The single builder can drop everything and act. The partnered builder must first have a conversation. There is also the phenomenon that might be called emotional bandwidth tax. Humans have a limited capacity for concern, for active worry, for tracking complex situations. When you are managing a relationship, a portion of that bandwidth is permanently allocated to relationship maintenance. You are tracking your partner's emotional state, anticipating their needs, managing conflicts, planning shared activities, and generally maintaining the social contract of the partnership. This is not a small allocation. For many people, the relationship is the primary emotional project of their lives, consuming more mental energy than their career. The single builder allocates that bandwidth differently. Where the partnered man is considering his wife's perspective on a business decision, the single man is considering a third or fourth angle of the business decision itself. Where the partnered man is spending cognitive energy on planning a vacation that will satisfy both parties, the single man is spending that energy on analyzing market trends or cultivating a strategic relationship. The cumulative effect over years is staggering. It is the difference between someone who has spent 10,000 hours genuinely thinking about their industry and someone who has spent 6,000 hours thinking about their industry and 4,000 hours thinking about relational dynamics. Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, repeatedly returns to the theme of how life is short, not in absolute terms, but because we squander so much of it on activities that do not serve our core objectives. He would look at the modern partnered professional spending his evenings discussing home renovations and weekend plans, and wonder what happened to the time that could have been spent on philosophy, on learning, on building something that outlasts the individual. This is not a condemnation of relationships, but an acknowledgement that they require a form of sacrifice that is rarely calculated honestly. Consider the gap that opens over a decade between two people of equal talent and intelligence, one who remains single and invests every available hour into professional development and wealth building, and one who partners and allocates a large portion of time and energy to relationship maintenance. In year 1, the difference is barely noticeable. By year 5, the single builder has acquired skills and experiences that his partnered peer simply has not had time to pursue. By year 10, they exist in different professional universes. The single builder has built a network twice as large, has launched ventures the partnered builder never attempted, has become expert in areas the partnered builder has only superficial knowledge of, and has compound knowledge advantages that make future learning and opportunity recognition far more efficient. This is the compound interest of focus, and it is perhaps the most underappreciated force in personal wealth creation. Money compounds at whatever rate you can achieve in your investments. Knowledge and skills compound at exponential rates because each new thing you learn makes the next thing easier to learn and more valuable in application. The person who can dedicate 60 focused hours per week to professional development versus 40 is not 50% more productive. Over time, they become 5 times, 10 times more capable because of how knowledge builds upon itself. And partnership, with all its genuine benefits, is fundamentally a decision to forgo access to those additional 20 hours per week during the crucial years when the foundation is being built. In military theory and strategic planning, there exists a concept that transcends specific tactics or technologies. It is the principle that speed itself is a weapon, that the capacity to make and implement decisions faster than your opponent creates a compounding advantage that can overcome deficits in resources or position. Sun Tzu built much of the art of war around this principle. Machiavelli understood it implicitly when he praised the decisive prince over the deliberative committee. In the context of personal wealth building, this translates into velocity of execution, the time between having an idea and implementing it, between recognizing an opportunity and seizing it, between deciding on a course of action and allocating resources toward it. The single builder operates as a benevolent dictator of his own economic state. He recognizes an opportunity. He evaluates it against his knowledge and resources. He decides. He acts. The entire cycle can occur in hours or days. There is no need for consensus, no requirement to explain the reasoning to anyone who might not share his knowledge base or risk tolerance, no negotiation about whether the resources should be deployed differently. This is not recklessness. This is the speed that is possible when you have built sufficient knowledge and eliminated all procedural friction from your decision-making process. Partnership, by its nature, introduces democracy into a domain that rewards dictatorship. Every significant financial decision must be discussed, explained, and agreed upon by both parties. This is not a failing of partnership. This is literally what partnership means. But it introduces delay into the system at exactly the point where delay is most costly. By the time you have explained the opportunity, addressed your partner's reasonable concerns, and reached a consensus, the opportunity may have passed. The undervalued asset has been recognized by others. The market has moved. The unique window has closed. Machiavelli wrote that a prince must learn to act swiftly, because fortune is a woman who favors the bold and the young, who move quickly rather than those who proceed cautiously. This metaphor, problematic by modern standards, captures a truth about the nature of opportunity. Markets, deals, and advantageous positions do not wait for consensus. They reward the first mover who recognizes value before others do. The entrepreneur who spends 3 months discussing with his wife whether to quit his job and pursue a startup is not wrong to have that discussion. But he is also not competitive with the entrepreneur who identifies the opportunity on Monday and has fully committed by Friday. There is a concept in warfare called the OODA loop, developed by military strategist John Boyd. It stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. Boyd argued that victory goes not necessarily to the side with more resources, but to the side that can cycle through this loop faster than the opponent. While the enemy is still observing the situation, you have already acted and changed the situation. While they are still deciding, you have moved 3 steps ahead. This principle applies with devastating effect to financial markets and business opportunities. The single builder with complete control over his resources and no requirement for consensus operates inside a much faster OODA loop than any partnership can achieve. He observes an opportunity. He orients his understanding based on his accumulated knowledge. He decides based on his risk tolerance and strategic objectives. He acts by immediately deploying capital or changing his position. The entire cycle can happen in the time it takes the partnered builder to schedule a conversation about the opportunity. And in markets where opportunities are zero-sum or nearly so, where only a limited number of people can exploit a particular market inefficiency or business opening, speed is not just an advantage. It is often the determining factor between success and failure. Consider also the flexibility advantage. The single builder can wake up one morning, recognize that his current strategy is not working, and completely pivot by that evening. His entire war room of resources can be redeployed toward a new objective without asking permission or explaining the logic to anyone who might not be equipped to evaluate it. This creates a form of predatory agility where he can exploit small, temporary opportunities that would not be worth the coordination cost in a partnership setting. The partnered builder must first convince his partner that the pivot is wise, that the current approach should be abandoned, and that the new direction justifies the risk and effort. By the time this process completes, the agile single builder has already tested the new approach, learned what works, and is collecting returns. Machiavelli counsels the prince to appear deliberative while being capable of swift, decisive action. In personal wealth building, the single builder is the prince. He has concentrated all decision-making authority in himself, eliminated all procedural delays, and created a structure where the gap between thought and action is as small as he can make it. This does not mean he acts without analysis. It means that once the analysis is complete, execution is immediate. And in a world where opportunities appear and vanish with increasing speed, where market inefficiencies are exploited within hours by algorithmic traders and well-capitalized funds, the individual who can still move with comparable speed possesses an enormous advantage. The ultimate question becomes, are you building for speed or for consensus, for maximum velocity of execution or for shared decision-making? There is no wrong answer, but there is a real trade-off. Partnership optimizes for shared journey, for building a life together, for emotional support and companionship. Solitary building optimizes for speed, for flexibility, for the capacity to take advantage of fleeting opportunities without friction. These are different objectives that lead to different destinations. The person who pretends they can fully optimize for both simultaneously is lying to themselves about the nature of the trade-offs involved. When you study the biographies of those who built significant independent wealth, who achieved true financial sovereignty rather than merely comfortable existence, a pattern emerges that is rarely discussed in polite company. Before they built their partnerships, they built their fortresses. They spent years, often the entirety of their 20s and into their 30s, constructing a position of such financial strength that they could afford to operate from a position of pure choice in all subsequent dealings. They created what might be called absolute optionality, the freedom to say no to everything that does not serve their interests without suffering any material consequence. The fortress, in Machiavellian terms, is not a physical structure, but a position that cannot be easily assaulted. For the prince, it was a combination of loyal troops, strategic alliances, and sufficient treasury to weather sieges. For the modern builder, it is a combination of assets that generate passive income, skills that are in demand regardless of economic conditions, and a cost structure so low that you can survive indefinitely without employment. It is the financial and professional position from which you negotiate with the world from a place of strength rather than need. Consider the fundamental asymmetry in how free and unfree people experience the same situation. An employer makes an unreasonable demand. The person who needs his paycheck complies. The person with 24 months of expenses saved and multiple alternative income streams asks, "What happens if I refuse?" The difference in outcome stems entirely from the fortress each has built. One has created the conditions for sovereignty. The other remains subject to the necessities of others. Machiavelli understood that power is not merely the capacity to force outcomes, but the capacity to decline participation in unfavorable situations without suffering for it. The prince who can afford to walk away from a bad alliance has more power than the prince who desperately needs allies regardless of terms. In personal finance, this translates directly. The man who can afford to quit his job, to refuse a romantic partner who creates more obligations than value, To decline social expectations that require expenditure, to walk away from any situation that does not serve his objectives, is free in a way that the man still climbing toward financial stability can never be. The construction of this fortress requires a period of aggressive deprivation that is incompatible with traditional partnership. You must accumulate enough capital that it begins generating its own returns. You must develop skills rare enough that you're not easily replaced. You must establish a reputation in your field such that opportunities seek you rather than the reverse. And you must do all of this while keeping your expenses so low that the runway is measured in years rather than months. This is a campaign, and like all campaigns, it demands total focus during the crucial period of execution. The timing matters enormously. Build the fortress first, and partnership becomes a luxury you can afford, entered into from a position of strength with full clarity about what you are accepting. Enter into partnership before the fortress is complete, and you are negotiating the construction of your sovereignty from within a structure designed to prevent the kind of single-minded execution that fortress building requires. The order of operations determines whether you achieve true freedom or merely comfortable dependence. There is a profound psychological difference between the man who built his fortress and then chose partnership versus the man who partnered before achieving security and is now attempting to build wealth from within the constraints of shared obligations. The first approaches the relationship from abundance. He is not partnering because he needs support, financial or otherwise. He is partnering because he has reached a level of achievement where he can afford to prioritize other values. His partner knows she is not a necessity, but a choice, which paradoxically creates a much healthier dynamic than the man who partners from need and then resents the obligations that partnership creates. Machiavelli writes extensively about the danger of being perceived as weak or dependent. The prince who appears to need his advisors is controlled by them. The prince who is known to be self-sufficient receives better counsel because his advisors know their positions are contingent on providing genuine value. In relationships, this same dynamic applies. Enter from a position of strength, and you attract different partners and create different relationship dynamics than if you enter from need. The man with options is not the same as the man grasping for security through partnership. The fortress provides more than just financial security. It provides psychological sovereignty, the knowledge that you can survive and even thrive regardless of what happens in any particular relationship, job, or social context. This knowledge changes how you move through the world. You speak more freely because you are not afraid of offending those who control your livelihood. You make decisions based on your judgment, rather than consensus, because you can afford to be proven wrong. You experiment and take risks because failure will not destroy you. You have built the foundation that makes all subsequent action less constrained by fear of loss. The ultimate goal is not wealth for its own sake, though wealth is a reliable scorecard for whether your strategies are working. The goal is sovereignty. It is the position where you owe nothing to anyone, where your survival and flourishing depend entirely on your own capabilities and decisions, where you have enough resources that you can afford to align all your activities with your values rather than with necessity. This is freedom, not in the abstract sense, but in the practical sense of being able to live according to your own design rather than according to templates provided by others. Seneca distinguished between wealth that enslaves and wealth that liberates. Wealth enslaves when you accumulate it to impress others, to maintain status, to sustain a lifestyle that requires constant income. Wealth liberates when you accumulate it specifically to buy back your time, to eliminate the necessity of working for others, to create the optionality that lets you spend your days as you see fit. The single builder, properly oriented, is constructing the liberating kind of wealth. He is not building to impress. He is building to escape, and escape requires a fortress first. The historical record is unambiguous. Those who built significant wealth young, who achieved financial independence in their 20s and 30s rather than waiting for retirement, almost universally followed a pattern of intense, focused accumulation during which personal relationships, social life, and comfort were secondary to the primary objective. They built the fortress first. They established themselves as sovereigns in their own financial kingdoms before they considered partnership. And when they did partner, it was from a position so strong that the partnership could not materially threaten the independence they had constructed. This is not a universal prescription. Many people will choose differently and will find satisfaction in paths that prioritize relationship over wealth, connection over sovereignty, shared journey over individual achievement. These are legitimate choices. But they are choices with real costs that should be acknowledged rather than obscured by comfortable myths about having it all. You cannot simultaneously optimize for partnership and for the kind of aggressive wealth building that requires total resource control, extreme risk tolerance, and complete flexibility in execution. You can achieve both sequentially. First the fortress, then, if desired, partnership. But the order matters absolutely. The final question that each man must answer for himself is whether he values sovereignty above companionship during the crucial years of wealth construction. There is no correct answer that applies to everyone. But there is an honest answer, and that answer will determine whether you follow the path of the builder or the path of the builder's contemporary, who is still explaining to his partner why he wants to take a risk that might, if it works, change everything. One path leads to a fortress. The other leads to consensus, comfort, and the quiet knowledge that you never tested the limits of what you could have built if you had been willing to walk alone. You have reached the end of this strategic briefing. What you do with this information will reveal something about who you are and what you value. If you have read this far, you are not someone satisfied with conventional wisdom. You are someone willing to examine uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, wealth, and freedom. The question is whether you have the virtue, in Machiavelli's sense, to act on what you now understand. The framework presented here is not a moral argument. It is a strategic analysis of how resource allocation, time management, and decision-making structures affect wealth-building outcomes. If your primary objective is to build significant, liberating wealth as rapidly as possible, the mathematics favor solitary execution during the construction phase. If your primary objective is companionship, emotional support, and building a shared life, then partnership should be prioritized and the wealth goals adjusted to what can be achieved within that structure. The error that most men make is assuming these objectives can be simultaneously optimized with no trade-off. They cannot. Machiavelli would counsel you to be clear about your actual objectives versus your stated objectives. Men often claim to value wealth and freedom while making daily choices that sacrifice both for comfort and approval. There is a discipline required to genuinely pursue sovereignty that most are unwilling to sustain. It demands living below your means for years while peers enjoy their earnings. It demands saying no to social expectations that require expenditure. It demands periods of isolation while you focus on building rather than maintaining relationships. It demands the intellectual honesty to admit that you cannot serve two masters, and that if wealth is truly your objective, then every decision must be filtered through whether it serves that objective or dilutes focus from it. The commitment I ask of you is not merely to consume this information, but to declare your intentions. In the ancient world, warriors would take public oaths before campaigns to bind themselves to the objective, even when motivation wavered. The public declaration created social accountability that increased follow-through. Modern psychology confirms that public commitment increases the likelihood of sustained action. Therefore, if this framework resonates with you, if you recognize yourself as someone willing to walk the path of the solitary builder during these crucial years, comment below with the words, I will build my empire. This is not a casual affirmation. This is a declaration that you are prioritizing fortress construction over partnership, sovereignty over consensus, aggressive wealth building over comfortable stability. It is a statement that you understand the trade-offs and have chosen the path of the prince rather than the path of the subject. Alternatively, if you recognize that you have already made this commitment but have been undermined by incremental compromises, by the slow drift toward comfort and consensus, comment, "Never broke again." This is the vow to return to the aggressive discipline that wealth building requires, to eliminate the expenditures and obligations that have accumulated, to remember that the fortress is not yet complete, and that every resource not deployed toward its completion is a delay in achieving the freedom you claim to want. This channel exists for those who take the study of power seriously, who recognize that wealth is not about possessions, but about sovereignty, and who are willing to examine strategies that polite society prefers to leave unspoken. If this is you, subscribe and enable notifications. The work we do here is not for those seeking comfortable affirmations of conventional wisdom. It is for those willing to think strategically about how to build positions of strength in a world that increasingly demands either independent capability or permanent dependence. The choice, as always, is yours. But understand that not choosing is itself a choice. Every year you delay the construction of your fortress is a year the compound interest of focused effort could have been working in your favor. Every obligation you accept is another constraint on your freedom of action. Every compromise you make with your wealth-building objectives in favor of present comfort is a bet that future you will not resent present you for choosing the easier path. Machiavelli's final lesson was that princes who understand power but fail to act on that understanding are no better than those who never understood. Knowledge without execution is entertainment, not transformation. You now understand the framework. The question is whether you possess the virtue to implement it, to endure the isolation and discipline it requires, to build your fortress before concerning yourself with anything else. The answer will be revealed not in what you comment, but in what you do when you close this video and return to your life. Build wisely, build alone, build your empire. Don't forget to give a like or a hype and subscribe to the channel. Watch the next video to complete everything you just learned.